So, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is Quentin Tarantino's love letter to movies of the past. More specifically, the like actors and like the movie culture of like the 1960s. Now, Tarantino's kind of branded himself as kind of like a film nerd. Like he loves to just gush about films all the time, and I couldn't help but think that the way he was kind of staging this particular film, which takes place in like 1969 in Hollywood, I kind of thought back to when he was talking about Rio Bravo as a great kind of like Western hangout film, where you just get to hang out with the characters, you get to know them, you get to like them, and just spend a lot of time with them. Now, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, unsurprisingly, is similar. We get to spend a lot of time with these characters within like showbiz, and we do get to see a lot of their environment. We do get to know them in quieter moments, in bigger moments, in emotional moments, and even in moments that kind of just seem like nothing. Like it takes its time to let us in with these characters. Now, at the same time, yes, it is very much like nostalgic wonderment of like looking back on Hollywood, but it also has this very like humanizing element to it, where there's this somewhat subtle tone throughout, about being in like the twilight of your life. Well, mostly when like you don't see it coming, where it's like you have this feeling that something is coming to an end here. Like sometimes you see it coming, and sometimes you don't, and sometimes you just take it as it comes. But I that particular aspect of the film I really enjoyed, and I found very different from a lot of Tarantino's other films, which are a little bit more blatant in its storytelling. So the story is about Rick Dalton, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who he's essentially kind of like Steve McQueen. In the sense that he was this actor who tried going into television on westerns from like the 50s, and it didn't quite work out for him, and now he's trying to get back into film, but at the same time he's having all these like guest spots on television, and basically he essentially says it himself, like he feels like he's washed up, like there's nothing left for him, like he feels like like the next stage in his life is he's gonna go off and do spaghetti westerns, and it kind of feels like like this is it. Like, this is kind of like the end of my career coming up here. Now, sticking with him through thick and thin is his stunt double of Cliff Booth, played by Brad Pitt. Now they have very clashing personalities here, and yet they stay friends. Like Rick is very very emotional. He takes stuff in. And can't process it as well. He's got a very nice place in Hollywood. He gets consistent work, but he has this washed up aspect to him where he breaks down into tears. Like even when he starts talking about stuff that might relate to his life, he just breaks down. Like if he flubs lines, he freaks out. Like he'll go into his trailer and just like cuss up a storm. He'll get into problems on set. He'll just be angry and bitter. Meanwhile, you have Cliff Booth, who's just kind of, he always seems to have the sunglasses on. He always seems to be constantly smiling. He seems to just take life as it is. And it's not that he has a great life. He lives in a trailer. He eats mac and cheese for dinner. He feeds his dog this kind of like weird, like typical like dog food that comes in a can that you just kind of like shake out. But he takes everything as it is, and he kind of like takes it easy. Even when he kind of realizes that this might be the end too, that like he can barely hang on to work, even more than Rick. So a lot of the times like Cliff he's not really working that much. He's just kind of like trying to find stuff to do. Maybe he's like helping out with like Rick's like TV antenna, or maybe he's picking up hitchhikers. He's just trying to find something to do. So we mostly just follow them throughout the film. Now you might be asking, well, what about other characters like Sharon Tate? You have Margot Robbie playing Sharon Tate here, and a lot of people might be surprised to know that she's actually not in the film that much. Now for a lot of people, like they might find this angering, like why why do we have like a film with Sharon Tate and she's kind of like barely in it? And I think there's a deliberate choice in this, because you'll also notice in this film that even though we have like we have like a kind of original characters like Rick Dalton, who's more or less like kind of like Steve McQueen, or you have Cliff Booth, which is kind of like more or less like the stunt double of like Burt Reynolds, like with like a similar relationship type deal. We mostly see like real actors and directors, but they're kind of like off to the side. You know, they're kind of like pushed off into the distance to seem almost kind of like you know, kind of like idols, like deities that like we can't quite touch, but that we can feel them there. Like we do spend a little bit of time with Sharon Tate. We spend time with her when she goes to like a movie theater to watch her film, and she can watch the audience's reaction. And she can laugh along with it, and she remembers all the work that she did within the film there. I mean, she has no idea. Like, 'cause if you're familiar with, like, Sharon Tate, yeah, you kind of know where this is leading up to. Especially when we bring in, you know, when we mention, like, the character of Charles Manson. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that, you know, Charles Manson is kept even more into the distance. So we have, like, both these conflicting forces of, like, good and evil that are kind of, like distant and off to the side. And they're we kind of almost kind of like worship them from afar, because there are other like we do actually have like the actual roles of like Steve McQueen and Roman Polanski. They're present, but we don't really follow them that much. Like I said, we get glimpses of them here and there, but they're kind of like pushed off as kind of like, you know, these idolized visions of them. And so we're mostly kind of like stuck with Rick and Cliff for most of the film. And I actually kind of dug this format. Now I know for a lot of people, you're probably coming here because Margot Robbie's a huge name, and you're probably expecting a lot of her. And unfortunately, you won't get too much of her past kind of being the kind of like the idol, like, you know, seeing her as like the, you know, kind of seeing her as like the ultimate good, as, you know, like a woman who's you know, who puts her all into acting, and she's pregnant with a child. And then you have Charles Manson, and it's interesting because we see more of the people around each of them. Like Rick Dalton lives right next to Sharon Tate, so we kind of see the people that orbit them. In the same sense with like Charles Manson, we see the people that orbit around him as well. So like they're very like off to the side. We don't quite touch them, but we can feel that something uneasy is coming. And it's made very evident, especially in scenes like there's a scene where Cliff kind of like wanders onto like a collective of the you know, of like the Charles Manson type followers, and he can tell that something is up here. Like it seems like it's staged like a horror movie, but he just kind of like walks into it because, like I said, it's kind of like that Brad Pitt relaxed persona that we've seen in a couple of films. We do get like, in fact, there's actually like a few more cameos of like other big names. Like sometimes the film outright mentions them, and sometimes they're just kind of like hidden in the back there. You kind of got to look for them. Like there's at one point we go to a Playboy Mansion party, and you kind of got to look in the background to see certain people there. It's a fairly big cast here, and they're playing a lot of familiar types of you know, of showbiz people that we've seen before. And there's a lot of like, of course, it goes without saying that there's a lot of nostalgic wonderment here. Like Tarantino is upfront, you know, about his love of like, you know, of classic Hollywood and westerns, especially like Sergio Leone, like spaghetti western type stuff. He gets like the little details in it right. I mean, he gets like the little details of like everything from 1969, you know, from like the way the cars look, to like the adverts that are heard on the radio, to the types of television shows that are made, to the way that movies are made, to the way that, like, you know, like an actor would practice lines. Like I love, there's one particular scene where Rick is kind of like sitting in the pool, and he's got like a, you know, kind of like an old-fashioned tape recorder, and he's listening back to himself read other people's lines so that he can react to them. I found that kind of interesting. And there's other little things here, like, you know, there's classic television, there's classic beer, there's all this kind of like throwback stuff. And Tarantino just lets us kind of like sit and stew in it. Like he lets us, like I said, you know, kind of like the same deal with like Rio Bravo. He kind of just lets us get to know these people and get to know their world and get inside them. And then, of course, we got to mention, I won't really reveal too much about it, but you might be thinking like, well, hang on here. Like, this is interesting and all, but, you know, it's a Tarantino film, so there's got to be some violence. And yes, there is some violence in the film, but it kind of surprises you. There's one really over-the-top, incredibly violent scene that just, it blindsides you, and I kind of dug it, because at that point, I think the film kind of realizes that, you know, we've assembled all these characters, so let's do something just a little bit wild with them. So, I mean, the film is it's fairly scattershot. Like I said, it's in typical Tarantino fashion, where it kind of moseys along from scene to scene, and it goes down these little holes of like having different conversations that you're not quite sure where they're going to lead. There's a little bit of like tension built up between certain scenes, especially when you can feel that something is coming to an end here. It kind of puts you a little bit on edge throughout. But I mean, the acting here is spot on. I love the vibe. I love the way that it's edited too. I was actually interested in how Tarantino. There's a few scenes where Tarantino actually does quick cuts, where instead of letting a conversation go on, he'll kind of like just like make quick cuts between different takes that go on within the film. And especially when we get to like montages of like Rick Dalton's career, like relating to like roles he could have had and roles he has had. I thought it was just brilliant in the way they kind of like dice those little segments up there. There's a lot of hilarious lines. There's a lot of scenes of there are fewer scenes of like brutality than say Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill, but it's so that one violent scene is so beautifully staged that I actually love it. So I mean, great acting, of course. I mean, you have an A-list cast here. They're doing their best. I love the way the era is set up. I love the way this film kind of takes its time to get to know these characters and the world that they occupy, and also try to like humanize this aspect of showbiz here. Like it's not just all like kind of like this dreamlike wonderment. It's also kind of like this somewhat terrifying realization that this is not going to last forever. Some people think it is going to last forever, and others realize that that their time is up, and that they I mean it's an uncertain career, and I love the fact that the film doesn't shy away from this and actually showcases that there's some melancholy in there, along with all the fast-paced wonderment of 1969. So I mean, what can I say? Tarantino's done it again. So for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, 4.5 out of 5 stars.